In the last third of the 19th century, esoteric traditions from both the East and the West were gaining greater popularity due to the efforts of a small group of individuals. Calling themselves Theosophists, they claimed no personal credit for the teachings they shared, but insisted instead that they came from a group of highly evolved souls attempting to help those in search of the spiritual. These larger-than-life beings were known as the Mahatmas.
If we accept this idea of the evolution in consciousness, or progressive development, and if we accept the idea that incarnation after incarnation, through our experience, we learn about the principles of life itself, and we develop, that is, become more aware of who and what we are, then it is a logical necessity that there will be a whole range of stages of development in humanity. Some will have learned more than others, had more incarnations than others, and so forth. And this is an obvious fact, even if we don't accept reincarnation, that people are at various stages of the development of the human potential. I mean, without any kind of judgment in terms of human worth, we can see that some people have a very highly developed mind. Some people have a very highly developed sense of human sensitivity. Others have the hides of rhinoceroses, right? There's no sensitivity, it seems, at all. Not without putting a judgment saying they're wrong or wicked or not worth as much as me or you. None of that stuff about human worth. But we can see that there are all kinds of grades of human development just by looking at humanity that we see. And if we accept the idea of reincarnation, then of course this is the possibility then deepens ever more. And it's a logical necessity then that such beings as what we call the masters should exist. That is, those who have gone before us and have realized the fullness of their human potential.
There have always been such individuals, rishis, saints, some of the great mystics of the world, great philosophers who seem to have a comprehensive understanding of the laws which govern man and the universe. Now, this tradition has always been very much alive in India, particularly, where the word Mahatma is used. We have it in Mahatma Gandhi, for example. A reverence for that kind of person who seems to embody a certain wisdom. The term itself means great soul.
It was a fiery Russian woman and student of the ancient wisdom tradition, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who introduced the Mahatmas to the Western world.
From the time she was a little child, she had visions of this tall, dark Hindu, and she felt in some way he was her protector. And when she was in London, I don't remember the year, it isn't important, there was some major festival, I believe, whatever it was, they had invited representatives from the colonies. And as this fancy parade was going by and she was watching it, there came this dark-skinned, tall Hindu that she had seen in psychic visions as a child. She saw him in the flesh, and everyone else saw him in the flesh because he was physically present, riding on a horse. And she, being a tremendously passionate Russian woman, ran out. And he put his hand out, according to the literature, and said, in effect, not now. And she stepped back. You can imagine the feelings she had. In Hyde Park, I believe the next day, she was walking through and met Moria.
This was in 1851-52, and she was about 20 years of age. She received orders to establish a society to bring to the world the ancient or ageless wisdom, this tradition. She even attempted to establish some kind of society, I think in the 1860s when she was in Egypt, but it didn't come through. Mm-hmm. And she was in Paris at the time. She says she received these orders to come to the United States and establish a society for the study and dissemination of what we call today Theosophy and the Theosophical.
While Madame Blavatsky stood as the key force behind the Mahatmas and the Theosophical Society, much of the information given to us directly by the Mahatmas is purported to have come in letters that mysteriously appeared to other individuals. The first known letter was written in November of 1870 and is currently in the archives of the Theosophical Society's international headquarters at Adyar, India. Written in French, it was sent to Blavatsky's aunt, Madame Fadif, who lived in the Russian city of Odessa. Blavatsky had been traveling to remote areas of the world for many years, and at the time of the letter's writing was in India, or perhaps even the outer regions of Tibet, pursuing her occult studies. Her family had no idea of her whereabouts.
Madame Fadif wrote, "We were ready to believe her, that is HPB, dead, when I received a letter from him whom I believe you call Kutumi, which was brought to me in my house by a messenger of Asiatic appearance, who then disappeared before my very eyes." Now, the letter itself states, "The noble relations of Madame H. Blavatsky have no cause whatsoever for grief." I'm reading, obviously, the English translation. You can read the French. "Their daughter and niece has not left this world at all. She is living and desires to make known to those whom she loves that she is well and quite happy in the distant and unknown retreat which she has selected for herself." After she met Colonel Alcott, and the story is, of course, part of the history of the Theosophical Society, and they were in New York, and at the time of the founding of the society, he received letters from another branch known as the Brotherhood of Luxor.
Also known as the Egyptian Brotherhood, the distinctive feature of their letters was that they were written on a kind of black paper, and, like most all of the Mahatma letters, contained various occult symbols which identified the particular group. These early letters can be found in C. Jinnarajadasa's 2 volumes, entitled Letters from the Masters of the Wisdom, and are reported to have been in connection with this group's interest in the formation of the Theosophical Society.
The chief of the Egyptian Brotherhood is said to be the adept who called himself Serapis Bey, and associated with him were others, among whom was Tuitit Bey, referred to several times by HPB. And this is the first page of the letter from this section, which begins, "Brother Neophyte, we greet thee. He who seeks us finds us. Try." And that word try appeared again and again and again in these early letters to Colonel Alcott.
The letters, however, most commonly referred to when talking about the Mahatma letters are those reported to have come from 2 individuals claiming membership in a fraternity of adepts known as the Tibetan Brotherhood. Commonly referred to by the initials M and KH, their names were Moria and Kuthumi. The bulk of their letters are currently housed in London's British Museum.
Some of the letters, instead of being sent by the post, some of them were sent by quite ordinary means, by the post office. Others were precipitated, psychically received, one by Alcott on shipboard when he was going to London to see Blavatsky, and he was very angry with her. He thought she was making a terrible mistake, and he was boiling. And a letter fell into his hands out of the air. Part of it read, "Your thoughts about her were very unkind just now." And the letter went on to say what they felt. Those precipitated letters, some of them, were on a kind of an oily paper. And the British Museum experts couldn't understand why the ink never smeared. It was a curiosity. Mind you, the British Museum are not saying these are precipitated letters. They're saying we don't see why that ink wasn't smeared around a little. Looks as though it's embedded in the paper.
Additional information on these mysterious letters can be found in Geoffrey Barborka's book, The Mahatmas and Their Letters. Barborka's extensive research on the letters includes detailed information of the purported paranormal events associated with their manufacture. For example, it was reported that the Mahatmas often enlisted the help of a key student, or chela, in the precipitation of their letters by a method that Madame Blavatsky described as psychological telegraphy. According to Blavatsky, a kind of electromagnetic connection is said to exist at the psychological level between the Mahatma and the chela. When the Mahatma wants a letter to be written, he signals the chela selected and directs his thoughts mentally in the form of words. With hands resting on a specially treated piece of paper, the chela acts as a kind of conscious channel through which the message can be transferred to the paper.
And that is the basis for most of the letters. And again, sometimes mistakes can creep in that way. You see, you may say to your secretary, well, this is what I want to say to that person.
You interpret it.
And you interpret it, you see.
Right.
And then if you read the letter over, you might say, well, I didn't just mean that, or I meant to say it this way, or you haven't quite got hold of my thought. So many of the letters were by a psychological telegraphy. And the closer the chela, which is again an Indian term, a Sanskrit term, pupil, the disciple, the closer his thought was with the Mahatmas, the clearer would be the communication, the writing down, the letter itself.
According to Barborka, there are two possible ways in which the message reaches the paper. It is either impressed into or precipitated onto the paper. Barborka cites one portion of a Mahatma letter written in November of 1880, in which Kutumi refers to the production of his letters. The section reads, "Bear in mind that these my letters are not written but impressed or precipitated, and then all mistakes corrected. The question arises as to whether the words impressed or precipitated are intended as synonyms of the same process or refer to two entirely different processes. Barborka suggests the latter of these two possibilities. For Barborka, impressed letters convey the appearance of being embedded inside the paper. Precipitated letters, on the other hand, while similar in general appearance to that of impressed letters, are quite different when viewed in detail. Here, unlike a normal writing stroke with pen or pencil, every letter of every word of a precipitated letter is made up of a series of very small diagonal strokes that appear to be on top of rather than inside the paper." Barborka also reports that when a mistake in this psychic transmission did occur, say for example with an impressed letter, it was corrected by psychically lifting it out of the paper. However, because the impression of the script was embedded in the paper, a smudge is left where the word had been situated. Finally, the correct word or sentence was then placed upon the smudged area. The correction, however, still gives the appearance of being embedded in the paper. While some feel that Barborka overanalyzes and points to distinctions that are hard to verify, skeptical scholars are still hard-pressed to suggest how these letters could have been written in any normal fashion. The majority of letters from Morya and Kutumi whether produced independently or with the help of a chela, were addressed to Alfred Percy Sinnett, an English newspaper editor in India.
HPB and the Colonel, of course, left the United States, went to India, arriving there in 1879, and Mr. Sinnett was a newspaper man, but he was interested in spiritualistic phenomena. In other words, he had heard of this from England and so on, was very interested, and as the editor of one of the most influential newspapers in India, was aware of the arrival in Bombay of these two very interesting people, the Russian and American, Blavatsky and Alcott, and wrote to them that he would be interested in meeting them, and of course invites them to come to visit him in Allahabad and then in Simla, where the British had their summer residence. The point is that Mr. Sinnett, having met HPB and the Colonel, said to HPB, "Would you think I can get in communication with these people that you call Mahatmas, masters, adepts?" And she said, "Well, I don't know, but write a letter and I will see." And so he writes a letter to the Mahatma, to the unknown brother, because it was unknown to him at the time. And HPB takes it, and the letter disappears. And in due time, he receives a response. Actually, before he received the first...
The very first Mahatma letter reported to have appeared in India was addressed, however, not to Mr. Sinnett, but to his wife, Patient Sinnett, and was received by her in Simla on September 29, 1880. Known as the famous Pink Note, it was said to have been precipitated by the Mahatma K.H. Kuthumi used various signatures when closing his letters. Written on a piece of pink notepaper originally belonging to Mrs. Sinnett, this initial letter said, "I believe I was asked to leave a note here. What can I do for you?"
Mrs. Sinnett and HPB, that's mentioned in the occult world again, it's spoken of. They went up into the hills just on a little excursion, probably just a pleasant little afternoon, and HPB turns to Mrs. Sinnett and says, in a joking way, "What's your heart's desire?" And on the spur of the moment, Mrs. Sinnett said, "To get a note from the brothers." Incidentally, we should point out that they did not call themselves Mahatmas or masters. They called themselves brothers. And so this was a term also that was used in those days. And so she said, "I'd like to get a note from the brothers." And so HPB took from her pocket a blank piece of paper, which was indeed been torn off of Mrs. Sinnett's own writing papers, and so it was a pink note with pink paper with a seal at the top of it, and she sort of communicated in her own way with someone, who, a distant brother, sort of was quiet. And she said to Mrs. Sinnett, "Where would you like to find this note?" And so Mrs. Sinnett thought, well, it might be interesting if it just fluttered down. And she thought, no, that's not very good. And said, well, supposing it were to be in that tree. And HPB said, very well. And they walk over to the tree, and there in where the limbs came together, one of these crooks of the tree, there was the note.
While the greatest amount of correspondence came from Kuthumi, Mr. Sinnett received a smaller number of letters from Moria. Considered to have been the adept most closely related to Madame Blavatsky, Moria's handwriting was much different in style from that of his associate K.H., and unlike the characteristic blue color of K.H.'s handwriting, Moria's letters appeared to be written in red ink.
There aren't many letters from the Master Moria. He nearly always wrote in red ink or red pencil. However, analysis does indicate, if you want to see the letters, that the letters or signatures were in about 15 different colors. when HPB came to the United States 1873, and she met Colonel Olcott 1874, long in there in the founding of the society, this was a period when there was a lot of spiritualistic phenomena, some of it fraudulent, some part of it, I suppose, authentic, and HPB said, of course, phenomena can be produced. Well, of course, from the very beginning, there were those who, particularly in India, the Christian missionaries. We have to remember it was a time of great missionary activity. The whole temper of the time was that we should get out there and convert the natives and save them, and so there was a great deal of missionary activity, and naturally this sort of threatened the Christianization, if we can put it that way, of India, because here were these two people, Olcott and Blavatsky, and then Sinnott and many others rallying around them, who were pointing to the original traditions of India and saying, don't lose those, these are valuable. It's just as important to be a good Hindu as it is for us to be good Christians or whatever. Revive your own faith and your own understanding. So immediately there arose, and also because of certain vindictiveness against HPB, again a full story, the whole Kulum controversy, which one can read about, which led to the charge that she had forged the letters. And in the midst of all of this, the British Society of Psychical Research sends a young and untried, inexperienced man, Richard Hodgson, out to India to investigate. And some of the disgruntled former employees at the headquarters combined with the Christian missionaries in Madras to bring forth evidence, very slanted evidence, and in itself forged evidence in some cases, to suggest that HPB was a fraud, that these letters had indeed been written by her.
However, a longtime student of theosophy and member of the Theosophical Society, Virginia Hanson, did an exhaustive study of the circumstances behind the Mahatma letters. In her book, Masters and Men, she demonstrates that many letters were delivered when Madame Blavatsky was nowhere in the area and under circumstances which she could not possibly have known their content. Probably the best example of this kind is the letter which was received by Annie Besant in 1900, 9 years after Blavatsky's death. And while many scholars currently cite the Hodgson report as proof that the Mahatma letters were forgeries, the Society for Psychical Research raised severe doubts about the report, and in 1986 finally published a new report declaring that Madame Blavatsky was unjustly condemned. The case had been re-examined by Dr. Vernon Harrison, past president of the Royal Photographic Society and an expert on forgery. In addition to demonstrating that the Hodgson report was biased and disregarded evidence in Blavatsky's favor, Dr. Harrison also carried out his own detailed analysis of the letters in question. He noticed that Hodgson's strongest evidence rested on the assertion that certain peculiar aspects of Madame Blavatsky's writing appeared throughout the KH writing. For example, Hodgson looked at Blavatsky's formation of the letters A, D, G, O, and Q, and noticed that she often left a gap on the left side of the curved portion of these letters. Hodgson called this the left gap stroke, and cited it as strong evidence against Madame Blavatsky, since this same tendency appeared in the KH writing. Dr. Harrison shows, however, that the left gap stroke is not uniquely characteristic of Madame Blavatsky's handwriting. Other well-known persons exhibiting this writing stroke include Mark Twain and former President Dwight D. Eisenhower. These and other problems with Hodgson's analysis led Dr. Harrison to conclude, among other things, that the Hodgson report is riddled with downright falsity, and that his case against Madame Blavatsky is not proven.
HPB, she's a paradoxical character. She really didn't care about public opinion. And she did some what we would think of as very foolish things. She herself, I suppose, was a kind of, well, at one point, you know, the master refers to her as a psychological cripple. And that's an interesting story in itself, that her connection with the masters, with the Mahatmas, her training in Tibet and her training in this knowledge, the esoteric philosophy, was such that when she entered the world, returned to the world, if we can put it that way, and began her teaching, began her dissemination of this philosophy, it's as though one part of her had to be kept in Tibet as a kind of assurance or insurance that the link would be maintained and she would not reveal more than was proper of the wisdom tradition. And so she was a kind of cripple. She had a very large body, as we know. She was subject to a great deal of illness. Practically everything that could go wrong with her internals seemed to have gone wrong. And so she didn't really, in herself, much care about public opinion. And she did do some things that could border on the tricksterish, border almost on the fraudulent. But when there was an order from her master, or when she was inwardly directed, when she was in tune with this work that she was given to do, then nothing else mattered. She was absolutely honest. There was an integrity there that she was committed fully, wholly. In the letters, particularly the letters to Sinnett, well, even in some of the others, but particularly in the letters to Sinnett, point out that phenomena has a tendency to feed on itself, and that therefore this was not what they were after. They were interested in presenting ideas, principles, the esoteric philosophy.
The esoteric philosophy covers a vast field. We can say that it covers indeed the whole of the evolutionary process, from the formation of matter in the first place, the formation of the planetary system in which we live, and then the evolution of the kingdoms of nature, the becoming of man, what man is, and the gradual evolution of the senses, because it takes enormous periods of time for each of the five senses, as developed so far, for them to come about. And then it looks also at the future evolution of man, because we are by no means finished. And part of the process is through reincarnation, through many experiences of earth life, so that the question of life after death, or rather life between lives, is also part of the province of the esoteric philosophy. And then all life is linked and kin, so that ethics comes in the consideration of how we should be living, and religious concepts. Is there a God? What is the purpose of the religions? The cosmos is seen always as one living whole, in which every part is related in some way and influences in some way every other part. The Mahatma letters report extensively on the question of life after death. We have first to consider what it means to be born, the taking on, as it were, of garments, vestures. The physical body is the most obvious one, but also other instruments or vehicles of consciousness for thinking and feeling and other types of experience. That is the process of being born. And so when it comes to dying, there is a gradual shedding of these vestures which have temporarily been used. So there is a withdrawal of consciousness from each one in turn. A study of the information given in the Mahatma letters does confirm the traditional view that death is by no means the end. It is a change in the focus of consciousness, a process during which the spiritual elements of the life just lived are welded into, I think a nice phrase here is, the enduring fabric of the ego, the enduring fabric. And that goes on, well, let us say, forever for the moment. And then what about the sins of omission and commission? They remain on the agenda for future incarnations because the learning is well nigh infinite. Now, an important aspect of the instruction given is that there can be no communication between those who have gone from us in death and those who remain behind. There are reasons, this is explained in some detail, but one reason is that you cannot at the same time enjoy bliss, and all the great scriptures speak of the bliss of the afterlife, that is the ultimate reward of the good, and at the same time see what is going on in the earth that we have left behind. That is not possible because the sensitivity of the individual makes him aware of the suffering, the cruelty, all the evil that belongs to the world. And so he cannot be happy when that is so. That is only one of the reasons. And so it would seem, as I understand it, that the current interest in what is called channeling is at best unwise and at worst positively dangerous, because one makes oneself sensitive to one doesn't know what. Nowhere at all is anyone encouraged to accept on authority. The Mahatmas, the authors of those letters, regarded themselves as followers of the Lord Buddha, and the Lord Buddha said nothing is to be accepted just because it is in a book that people think of as holy or because an authority has uttered it. And that is the attitude which the Mahatmas themselves encouraged in those who approached them and in the letters themselves. And this attitude is summed up in a sentence by the president-founder, Colonel Olcott. At the inauguration of the Society in 1875, we seek, inquire, reject nothing without cause, accept nothing without proof. We are students, not teachers. And he declared most strongly that any suggestion of leaning upon an authority, even that of the Mahatmas, was to be deplored. Always, the sentence that comes to my mind is, "Be ye lamps unto yourselves." And I think that sums up the attitude of the Mahatmas. There is no question of blind faith or blind following. All the way through, they indicate that a person has to find out for himself. The methods used are not fundamentally different from those of the sciences that we are accustomed to, that is, investigation, experimenting, proving, attempting to prove, to corroborate the teaching that one has heard by living according to the findings that are offered to us. And we can do that in quite simple ways, as for instance, with the exercise of control over thought. We can make a difference to our own lives. There is one important difference between the sciences that we know in the world and occult science, and that is that whereas our sciences depend on refined apparatus for further exploration, occult science depends on the evolution of faculties within the individual until he comes to know for himself. And all the accumulated knowledge has been attained in this way.
While many modern scholars of theosophy have focused on historical and factual evidence surrounding the Mahatmas, other scholars see the essential value of the Mahatmas within a mythical context. Professor Stephen Heller.
Here also we are dealing with a very important mythologem. It is the mythologem of the wise old spiritual person. And it has been said, for instance, in Jungian psychology or elsewhere, that whenever a person comes to a certain level of spiritual development, some sort of an encounter with this elder wise figure occurs. And so we find it in imagery and in mythology. Let's say the hermit of the tarot card, or any number of encounters with the Ancient of Days and wise figures, holy men, Christ, and so forth. Now, here again, if we can look upon the issue and even the possible personal relationship with the masters that a lot of people cultivate as an internal myth of ourselves, like almost a stage in our own development that we can now contemplate such a contact, rather than a kind of a factual exposition again, that there are so many masters and one of them is 6 feet tall and his beard is red, and the other one is, and they live in the Himalayas and their house looks like this and that, as we find. You know, those are the perception of some clairvoyance that is interesting, but the essence of this is there a master within me whom I can experience as an aspect of my own development, and not just somebody way out there in Tibet or somewhere else. So this is also an important mythologem that we need to explore as a myth capable of being internalized and at the same time being an avenue to transcendence.
There has been time to look at only a few of the fascinating events and people associated with the Mahatmas and the Mahatma letters. Today, there are various persons claiming to be psychic channels of some great spiritual message. Whether such claims should be taken seriously is, at best, a difficult question to answer.
One doesn't know. There have been no letters as such brought to the attention of the world, as it were, to responsible people. Even at the period of after H.P.B's death, William Judge claimed to have received communications. This is very difficult to judge. And today there are people who are claiming to be in touch with adepts and masters, and sometimes strange names are given to them and so on, the masters I mean. Or maybe the same ones, Moria, K.H., these names have been bandied about. And the masters themselves indicate, incidentally, in the letters that they knew this would happen, that probably they would be misunderstood and misjudged, and that they were very reluctant. There were many in the so-called brotherhood, I say so-called because whether one accepts it or not is for each individual to determine, but among the brotherhood of Mahatmas, who were very much opposed to this kind of communication, saying this will be abused, it will be misused, it will be misunderstood. And so there are people who are claimants to receiving messages which they themselves write down. I think one can only judge it by the content. Is it of this same caliber of content? Is it the presentation of deeper or wider, broader explanations of teachings already given? So I think one has to look at the messages being received today. In the 1900 letter to Annie Besant, the Master K.H. says very clearly, the cult about masters must be put down. And this was interpreted to mean that we should not use them, and they themselves say this in the letters, we should not use them as authority, but rather as individuals, as one would respect and revere and acknowledge any great teacher who has had a profound influence on one's understanding, one's life, and has pointed the way